Hello everybody, my name is Martin Hurt. I'm going to moderate today's discussion and we are going to wait a couple of more minutes to allow the audience to join us before we kick off with the discussion. So please bear with me. I see that we already have many people following us, but we are still waiting 2 more minutes before we start with the discussion. So, I think it is time to start. We have waited a couple of minutes for people to join us, but in order to kick off with the discussion, I would like to wish you welcome to this webinar organized by NATO Headquarters Public Diplomacy Division in cooperation with the Estonian Atlantic Treaty Association. This non-governmental organization was established in 2001, representing NATO's values and raising awareness of security and defense topics among the population of Estonia and also abroad. It has become a stable and respected platform for discussion on foreign and security policy, international relations and security issues. My name is Martin Hurt and I'm a research fellow here at the International Center for Defense and Security based in Tallinn, Estonia, and I will moderate today's event. Before we start, I will make a few administrative remarks. NATO Headquarters will live stream this event on the NATO Engagements Facebook group. This webinar can also be followed via YouTube, and it is being recorded for publishing after the event. Chatham House rules do therefore not apply. I repeat, do not apply. The audience that participates via Zoom can submit questions through the Q&A system in a written form, and I encourage you to use this opportunity. The Q&A button is situated at the bottom of your Zoom window. With this, I would like to introduce our speakers of today, starting with Ms. Burcu San, who is the Director of Operations in NATO's Operations Division since February 2019. She is responsible for ensuring the effective strategic oversight of the Alliance's current and future operations and missions. She studied international relations in her hometown, Ankara, and started her career in 1994 with an internship at the European Commission. She has also worked at the Council of Europe as liaison officer to the OSCE, and she has served as Deputy Director of the Private Office of Secretary General Lord Robertson and Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, and has later worked with civilian military planning and operational and civil preparedness in NATO Headquarters. Ambassador Küllike Sillaste-Elling serves as the permanent representative of Estonia to NATO since 2017. Before, she was the foreign policy advisor to the President of Estonia, worked as Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tallinn, as Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister, and she has been in foreign service at the Estonian embassies in Washington, D.C. and London. I will introduce our third speaker today, Mr. Sven Sakkov. Sven is the Director of the International Center for Defense and Security here in Tallinn, Estonia. Sven has worked on many positions in the Estonian Ministry of Defense, most recently as a Defense Policy Director of the Estonian MOD. And he has also worked as an advisor to the President of Estonia. Before joining ICDS, Sven Sakkov served for 2 years as the Director of NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. So I am in a position of moderating a discussion with both my current boss at ICDS and my previous boss at the Estonian delegation to NATO. The name of this event is NATO in a post-COVID world, and I think it's very well phrased. It puts the focus on the COVID-19 pandemic, but not only, because the threats and the security environment that affected us before the pandemic has not disappeared. The title is forward-looking, so I look forward to this discussion today to cover both the pandemic itself, but also life after COVID-19. So I think this is the kickoff that I intend to do. I will ask all three speakers to describe the role of NATO in the pandemic, and also with a view to the future, bearing also in mind the summit that is scheduled for next year. And with this, I will pass the floor to our first speaker today, Ms. Burcu San. Sorry.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for kicking us off in such a wise manner. And I would like to thank, first of all, the Estonian Atlantic Treaty Association for having me join this Zoom meeting. I hope there are many of you out there listening to us. And I'm very happy to speak at such a distinguished panel, if I may say, even though it's a virtual panel. I want to kick off by saying that COVID-19 has been a systemic or shock, so to speak. But NATO has, as usual, adapted very well and very quickly, and we are also already looking forward as to what will come in the post-COVID world. So first, I have 5 points to make as an introduction. My first point is that COVID-19 has reaffirmed NATO's value, both in terms of its political closeness, the solidarity that the allies have shown between them, very much true to the spirit of our collective security, collective defense mantras. So even in the midst of immense difficulties domestically at home, they have actually stepped up and helped each other, and also helped partners across the world. So that, I believe, has been an important outcome. And also the value of NATO's tools was reconfirmed as well. We have used many of our tools, in fact, designated first of all for different purposes, but quickly repurposed and used to good effect, including our Disaster Response Coordination Center, the NATO Procurement Agency, the airlift capabilities that we have, a rapid air mobility system or program, and also, of course, our NATO command structure. And so my conclusion from that first point is that COVID-19, the pandemic, has showed again that we have a very flexible alliance at the disposal of the allies, with robust and adaptable tools that can be used to good effect. The second COVID-19 related issue that I want to highlight is that this pandemic has also shown the value of the armed forces in general. The armed forces domestically in many of our nations and many of our partner nations across the world have been used again to good effect to help the civilian responders. The armed forces have not sat idle. They have many important, unique contributions to make in such disasters. And they have actually been used in logistics, movement of equipment, of patients. They have provided field hospitals or hospital ships. They have been used in disinfection and planning, engineering, logistics in many different ways by different nations. So again, the armed forces have come out of this pandemic, I think, well respected and having done a good job. The third issue that was highlighted by the pandemic is that information space has become a key battleground. I think we've known this for some time, but the pandemic has really highlighted and underlined it. There's been a lot of disinformation, a lot of manipulation and propaganda going on. You well know this in Estonia and elsewhere. There's been this propaganda that the Russian and the Chinese system of government is superior to that of our democracies because they're more agile, they act more quickly or more effectively, etc., which is of course completely false. There has been a lot of disinformation about the origins of the virus. There's also been some fake news regarding our battle groups. All sorts of different tools has been used in this information space. And this, I think, has underlined once again the importance of working together with allies, with partners, with the EU, European Union, to expose such disinformation campaigns, such propaganda, and to come out with the truth. The fourth point I'd like to make is, in a way, a little bit disappointing, perhaps because this COVID-19 could have actually made a difference in the world. But we see that the former rivalries have not gone away, and the threats and challenges that we have been facing pre-COVID still exist today. In fact, perhaps have even been heightened. There's a risk of our potential adversaries to take advantage of the distraction that COVID has imposed on us. Both state and non-state actors might try to take advantage of this. And so I think the lesson here is that we absolutely need to remain vigilant. And we need to continue to focus on NATO's core purpose and core tasks. This is very important. We have to continue our work on deterrence and defense. We have to continue our operations, missions, and activities. And we have been, in fact, doing so. Even despite this pandemic, NATO has been unwavering in its commitment to collective defense. We have, of course, the enhanced forward presence, the air policing that has been continuing. Even our exercises, some had to be cancelled, some of them had to be adapted, but they do continue at this very moment. In fact, Baltops is continuing as a naval exercise with the participation of 19 allies and partners. And Defender Europe 2020, which was supposed to be very big, is still going on, is not as big as we had envisaged, but this is a US-led exercise, of course, with participation of many allies. So that also has been adapted, but has not been, let's say, cancelled. We likewise continue with our operations in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and we continue to reach out to partners. In fact, if anything, I think this crisis again has underlined the need to think and act with partners, also think more globally, be in touch more globally with partners such as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and many others across the world, because I think this was an issue that was debated in the security conference in Munich earlier this year. What is the West? Is it a geographical definition, or is it a political definition? And I think there's an emerging consensus that we have a political West, so to speak, with the democratic institutions, which we need to protect also globally. And my last point, Martin, I'm sorry if I've taken a bit more time, is that we have relearned perhaps that resilience is key. We have been working on this for quite some time now. You have highlighted in my CV that I was responsible for civil preparedness and resilience. So I am no longer, directly responsible for it, but it's really close to my heart. The Article 3 obligations of the allies, which is both of the allies individually and collectively, because in the end, the alliance is as strong as its weakest link. Therefore, each ally, of course, has to do its homework and be able to withstand attack. And attack here is not just military attack. I think we've come to understand this in a much broader context, also with hybrid threats that we've been facing. So it's very important to have civil preparedness for all hazards, and also be able to support the military if necessary through civilian means. And we have to remember that the next crisis will not be the same, so we need to be prepared for all contingencies. And a very last point is that I think all of this gives a lot of food for thought for the reflection process that the Secretary General launched last Monday to make a strong alliance even stronger. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Burcu. Thank you for listing the tools that NATO has employed during the pandemic, and also thank you very much for pointing out the importance of resilience. And I know we will come back to this topic later on because we have already received at least one very good question on resilience. Thank you once more, and with that I would like to pass the floor on to Ambassador Sillaste-Elling to talk about how the pandemic has affected NATO and how the narrative has changed, in case it has changed. Do you focus more now on the pandemic or on the effects of the pandemic, or has the pandemic made visible other threats and challenges which were perhaps visible before the beginning of this year? Please.
Great, thank you, Martin, and great to see you and Sven. And knowing that you're in Tallinn is making me even more homesick than before. It's been quite many months since we've been able to travel anywhere, but hopefully the summer will bring me back to Estonia. And thank you to the Estonian Atlantic Treaty Association for inviting me and for organizing this event. Well, from the point of view from an ally here in the HQ, and I completely agree with everything, of course, that Burcu just said, and the way she described NATO's response. And I was thinking back to the beginning of the crisis back in March, and it clearly hit all of us, nations, NATO, other organizations, unexpectedly. No doubt about that. But I think it's quite amazing how quickly NATO adapted and started actually responding to the crisis. And I think it says a lot about NATO being sort of an organization that is, I think, wired to deal with crises. It's kind of in NATO's DNA in a way. The title you mentioned is post-COVID, and I think it's always very welcome to look at the future and have a forward-looking view. I did, however, want to just point out that I think we're not in a post-COVID situation in even some parts of the Euro-Atlantic area yet. As I said, allies or nations have been moving at different paces. We're not there yet, and I think globally speaking, also the crisis or COVID is only just arriving to certain regions. We just need to keep that in mind. As far as the response, again, I think you asked the question about the focus, the threats and challenges, and I've been getting that question a lot from Estonians, but also from others. You know, and I sensed an underlying concern that, oh no, is NATO now turning into an anti-pandemic organization? And I can assure you, no. And I remember, again, the beginning of the discussions here at NATO. What are we going to do? How are we going to respond? I mean, there was never a question of not responding, given the nature of the pandemic itself. But from the very beginning, it was clear that NATO would keep dealing with the core tasks and the core business, and that security is the most important task at hand. And you've heard this sentence said many times by Secretary General, but also by others, that the goal was to make sure that this health, economic crisis, civilian crisis doesn't become a security crisis. So, as Burcu said, no changes in NATO's posture. Missions, operations, activities have been going on, including in Estonia. You know, EFP is there. I think even the framework nation, UK, rotated, I believe, all of its brigade during the crisis, actually, which I think shows a lot in terms of resilience and ability to organize these things. So activities were going on despite the pandemic. But of course, NATO was also responding and being sort of not the first responder, but playing a supportive role in the pandemic, providing, you know, logistics support, so transport, but also providing very vital medical supplies. So as you might recall, Estonia also provided some much needed masks to our very good allies in the south to Italy and to Spain. And I think that's the solidarity piece that again, Burcu mentioned, that has been very important, because the pandemic did hit allies at different times and kind of on different levels, but all of those, I think, allies, I think, that could help, did help others. And I think that there was certainly a strengthening of this feeling of solidarity throughout the crisis. Now, on the threats, I mentioned, I think NATO has been adapting, as we know, for a number of years now, and adapting to all kinds of different threats coming from different directions. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that just because now there's this pandemic threat that's on our radar, it doesn't mean that we're not keeping an eye on all the other threats also. I mean, we're capable of doing many things at once. And so nothing has changed. I think actually what might happen, or what we've seen, is maybe, as was mentioned before, that some of the threats have actually come more to the fore and been even highlighted even more. So disinformation is, I think, a very key area. Yes, it was on our radar before, we were talking about it, but now I think throughout the pandemic, we've seen some very stark examples of how disinformation, propaganda, false narratives are being used, how some of our adversaries are trying to kind of split us within the alliance. And so I think actually the threat picture hasn't changed. If anything, we've seen even more sort of issues being highlighted.
Thank you, Ambassador Sillaste-Elling, for these very wise comments, and for pointing out the examples of solidarity that we saw, and for pointing out that the focus of NATO will still be on security and defense, and not shift more to pandemics and similar challenges. With that, I would like to pass the floor over to Sven Sakkov. Please, Sven.
Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you for all the people watching us, either at Zoom or in some other way. I want to acknowledge and say hello to ambassadors I see have joined us, and of course also those people who have joined us from far away. Hello, Jim in Washington, D.C., and hello, Mikko in Cairo. I will try to talk about basically what the topic is kind of the post-COVID world and NATO. And I'm starting from the obvious, which is that without the US, there is no NATO. And here are some factors we need to look at while dissecting that notion. The first is that we see very clearly that the attention of the United States has turned, and is going even more to be turned, to the Far East. The second is the fact that US has become self-sufficient in oil and gas, and that has actually allowed the US also to turn its attention away from Europe, because in a way Europe is geographically in a correct position in order to do power projection of the United States, if necessary also to the Middle East, basically to the oil-rich Middle East region. And then the third factor is let it put it this way, very peculiar presidency of Donald Trump, and what all that means to the alliance, whether for the next half a year or whether for the next 4.5 years. Now, talking about US, I think it's if you try to simplify the challenge ahead, what US has, I have said the US has to manage simultaneously the decline of Russia and the rise of China. Do those things at the same time. And the latter, basically, how to manage the rise of China, is way more prominent in American thinking than how to manage the decline of aggressive Russia. When you look at US, this is a bipartisan. the understanding of China as a big systemic competitor for the US for the generation of generations. It is even more than bipartisan, it is societal. Now, at the same time, we live in a world where Europe needs United States in order to contain Russia militarily. Europe cannot do it alone on its own. All those talks about Europe doing that without the United States, those people do not have a understanding of military necessities. If someone wants to read about that, I recommend to look at the study from end of 2018, published by the IISS and the GAP on what would that entail and how much investment in defense is lacking. So basically, on the one hand, Europe needs US in order to contain Russia militarily. At the same time, the United States needs Europe in order to contain China politically and militarily. And I think here is a possibility for this kind of, let's say, new transatlantic deal or a compact or a charter. Well, I think looking at that, the biggest problem is that there are quite influential people in Europe who would, instead of supporting our biggest and most important ally on whom we also depend, they want to split the difference between the US on the one side and China on the other side and make profit out of it. If that happens and if that thinking prevails, I'm afraid that NATO will, because of a disinterest of the United States, become a new WEU, Western European Union, which for decades, as an organization, operated in Brussels, but actually knew no one from outside of a foreign policy community had any idea what it does. It had its own ambassadors, military committee, all that kind of thing, and nothing happens. It was just an empty shell of an organization. Now, it has been said by someone I cannot have not been able to find out who said it originally, that NATO as an organization is in a great shape, but NATO as an alliance is half dead. And this is, of course, that person really was looking at the peculiarities of the Trump presidency. And now this can change in November. But a longer and more systemic problem is, of course, or might be, is that if US will determine in the future that Europe is not relevant or works against the US big generational, let's say, struggle against People's Republic of China. And I think this would be the sounding the death bells of NATO if that happens. Now, one might ask, what on earth could actually NATO do in order to assist the US in its challenge vis-a-vis People's Republic of China? I have 7 points to suggest. First is to actually to keep moving towards the 2% goal, so that actually Europe has a capacity, military capacity. Second is to serve as a consultation forum between North America and Europe, also when it comes to issues connected with People's Republic of China. Third, ensure that Europe's own backyard, including NATO's own territory, is safe and secure, so that actually US can turn more attention to the Far East. That basically means defense, deterrence issues, forward presence, all this kind of stuff. Fourth, to develop a comprehensive dime strategy to deal with the rise of China, and the dime meaning the diplomacy, information, military, and economy, military terminology. And here, military is by far the least important, the smallest part of the dime strategy. But diplomacy, information, and economy are very important. Fifth, for NATO allies to restrict collectively transfer of technology for the BRC, what might be used for the also for the cutting-edge military technological breakthroughs. Basically, something akin to the Cold War CONCON, which was basically against the communist bloc countries. 6, develop the partnership with democracies, meaning NATO partnership, with democracies in a Indo-Pacific area, those who want to join. But we can, of course, think of Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, maybe India. Let's call it, for example, Partnership for Democracy. And of course, as is the case with P4P, it is a menu. So we say every country, every partner can have as far a cooperation with NATO as the country wishes. And the 7th is basically NATO common structure, NATO as an organization to assist, if it is practical, those allies who are conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Far East. Of course, there are very few allies who do it. And now the last point, which is basically not about what NATO could do in terms of assisting US, and this is about the defense investments. And picking on what Küllike said, that we need to make sure that the health crisis, which has spawned a crisis, economic crisis, will not turn into a security crisis. When defense investment is crucial. Last 5 years have been actually very good. The Canadian and European members of NATO have increased the defense spending from 254 billion to 309 billion. And now the issue is, how will that be managed in the future when the economic cost of a downturn will kick in, and whether defense will not suffer because of a economic crisis which has been induced by the health crisis. There are some positive examples. For example, Norway has declared that it is, continuing on its 2% path exactly as it has promised to. And Finland, which is of course outside of NATO, said that the economic crisis will not impact their biggest ticket acquisition of a 5th generation fighter aircraft program. I hope that other countries in NATO will follow and reiterate this issue of a movement towards the 2%. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven, for focusing much on what Europe could do to support the US and focus on China in the future. I would like us now to focus on the questions that we have received. And we received a number yesterday, and I will first very briefly turn to our 2 speakers in Brussels and ask for a very short comment on whether you have been able to identify some lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that probably there is no official lessons learned process that has been implemented so quickly yet, but could you please point out both at least one big takeaway from the pandemic, Ambassador Sillaste-Elling and Ms. San, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, maybe I point to two, if I may. You asked for one, but two aspects that jump to mind. One is, of course, the readiness. And as we're looking towards the future, and even the near future in the autumn, the possibility of a second wave, of course, is being discussed, I think, in capitals, but also here. I mean, I think we have to try and be as ready as possible, both in terms of supporting each other, having already some, dare I say, stockpile, some equipment, so that we don't start looking around for masks and other equipment that we need immediately should a second wave hit us. So readiness is certainly one thing. And you can also do a lot of planning in advance in terms of looking at how to transport certain equipment from one part of the alliance to the other. And work is going on in all these fields, which is very welcome. But the second aspect I wanted to mention that I think we all felt was the importance of having secure lines of communication. That's sort of the digital aspect. Yes, some of the secure lines, I think, are already there. Allies have them nationally. NATO has also some facilities in place, but here I think we need to do more. We need to really do more and be ready so that we can, no matter what happens, be it a pandemic or any other kind of a crisis, we can continue with business as usual, as smoothly as possible.
And I would say that, first of all, agreeing with all those points, the importance of keeping with the core tasks of NATO is clear. So we cannot afford to lift our eye off the ball in that regard, and to work on resilience and preparedness, as the ambassador has also said.
Thank you. I know that Sven wants to jump in as well. Please, Sven.
For me, one of the lessons learned, and this is not on a level of NATO, but on a level of individual countries, it shows how important the redundant capability of defense forces and voluntary defense organizations like Defense League in Estonia are in times of crisis. For example, I give the international audience of this webinar an example that every Estonian knows it by heart, is that we have a biggest island in Estonia called Saaremaa, which was really badly hit with a virus, because it hosted a volleyball team from Milan on the 5th of March, and then basically it spread it quickly in this island. And Ireland, basically by now, it has a 1/40 of Estonian population, but had 1/3 of the cases of virus. So Estonia coped extremely well, at least until now, touch wood. But there was one island which was really under heavy stress. So basically what Estonia did, the Estonian Defense Forces moved to the island and set up a field hospital, equipped with everything, including 12 ICU beds, and was able basically to contain that. This kind of extra capacity was really handy. When you look at the Estonian planning staff, crisis planning staff, during this pandemic, half of the people you saw on screen were in uniform. Basically people who know how to plan and how to work on an operation as such. And of course, when it comes to redundant capacity, we saw the valiant efforts, for example, by German Luftwaffe, which was transporting heavy, let's say, very, very hard cases of patients from Italy and France to German military hospitals, maybe also civilian ones for the treatment. Such kind of things, I think, underline defense forces and the money invested in them are important, not just in times of war, but also in some civil emergencies.
So thank you very much. So I take that readiness is important, preparations for the either the second wave of the COVID pandemic or whatever crisis may occur in the future, pointing out the need for increased resilience, secure communications, and of course the value and utility of having capable armed forces. And one of the questions that we have received today is about to what extent will now the coronavirus compel NATO allies to enhance resilience in line with the 7 baseline requirements adopted at the Warsaw Summit back in 2016. Do you foresee any areas beyond healthcare that could be affected as you see, bearing in mind that this is of course a national responsibility? Who would like to take on this question?
The ambassador is pointing at me. So
Sorry.
It's a great question, and I'm happy that you brought up the baseline requirements for resilience. I think it was always clear that we would continuously review them and revise them as necessary. And this work is indeed ongoing with regard to also this new pandemic that we are facing. You pointed out that health sector, in fact, mass casualties is one of the baseline requirements areas that we look at, certainly very directly affected by this experience, but also many other areas. And one of them, the ambassador pointed out, is the secure lines of communication. So that is both with regard to defending against cyber threats and also lines of communication in terms of transportation as well. Everything is interlinked, and we now, as this webinar is also an example, rely much more on the internet and on secure communications between us. We have, as you know, had 3 ministerial meetings on secure line. We are having another one next week. So it is very much, we are depending on these connections at the moment, and perhaps for the foreseeable future as things develop. The European Union also has held several ministerial meetings like this. This seems to be the future. We have to work on making them absolutely robust and resilient. There are among the baseline requirements also this importance of 5G has already been taken into account, and I think more light has been shed again on this issue as well. And NATO has not prescribed to its allies any, avoidance of any particular company or particular country. But what we have underlined is that there has to be absolute vigilance and a very good understanding of the possible vulnerabilities in before going into some long-standing contractual engagements, arrangements with any one company or another. So all these issues are taken together and being discussed at the right committees at the expert level, also in the council. And the Secretary General will line up the defense ministerial decisions early next week, and he will touch upon this question of the baseline requirements as well.
Thank you. And I have also received a couple of questions related to disinformation. One more perhaps theoretical, one is more practical and perhaps even an example of such. The first is about an increased level of disinformation from Russia and China. They even work together. What are the predictions for the post-COVID-19 regarding disinformation? Do you believe that this will increase in the future? Will China and Russia, and also possibly Iran, keep working together and what does this threat, how does it affect NATO as such? And I see that Sven would like to take this on.
Well, at least I will try to open it up. I'm not sure that we have a good evidence that China and Russia have been working together. If the persons pose the question would be so kind and write into Q&A a link where I can look it up. Maybe I have overlooked something. I think overall it has been a lot of talk has been about the possibility of a alliance between Russia and China. For example, in the context of where U.S. foreign policy is, and whether that will not push Russia and China closer together into alliance. At a Lennart Meri conference, which is the annual security conference that ICDS is organizing in Tallinn, one year, one European diplomat, ambassador, who had been ambassador both in Beijing and Moscow, said, that was many years ago already, that if someone suggests that there is a possibility of an alliance between People's Republic of China and Russian Federation, that goes to show that that person does not know neither China nor Russia. And I hope that someone will also tell President Macron of France that, because this is a dangerous dream or a kind of a dangerous boogeyman what some Europeans and some European leaders have fought for themselves, but there is a possibility of that, and hence we need to move closer to Russia, because China is such a big and looming new thing. And despite basically the fact that Russia has been doing its utmost to destroy the European security architecture, has attacked both in the last 12 years, both Georgia and Ukraine, is ongoing a slow burning war against Ukraine. Shot down MH17, is now involved in the Libyan civil war, has committed atrocities and war crimes in Syria and so forth. So basically, I want to refute that idea that this is a possibility. But when it comes to the information operations directed against the West, what we have seen, to my best knowledge, is that China has been learning from what Russia has been doing before. I think the learning curve is going to be very sharp, because China has not been doing it very well. I would rather say it has been doing it in a ham-fisted manner. Russia has been much better in that. And of course, the one thing I want to add here as a last point in this intervention is that I have an understanding that at the first part of a pandemic, or a first month of pandemic until mid-April, Russian internet trolls and all the usual malign actors were quite active in trying to subvert the West and to sow discord and so forth, everything what they do. But until the time came when actually pandemic hit hard also Russian Federation. And then basically there was a call for all those internet trolls to focus on the things back home in Russia. And basically that ceased. I do not know how it is the situation now. This information is already many weeks out. I will limit myself here.
One thought also on this information. I think It's true that disinformation campaigns have been heightened, but also I think there's more and more awareness of these kinds of campaigns among the public, our public opinion. I happen to be in some WhatsApp groups, of my high school friends, university friends. There's one or the other member will forward a link, and then almost immediately another member will say, well, this was already defunct, the fact, check your facts before forwarding such things, etc. So I think the civil society has become more aware of these issues, and there's a lot of fact checking also going on. Perhaps some segments remain naive. They perhaps want to believe in things that they see on Facebook or Twitter just because it maybe speaks to their beliefs already. But there's also more and more awareness. I also wanted to, Sven highlighted the Estonian example of how your society is so well connected, civil and military. And this has been something that I observed when I visited Estonia. Also the other two Baltic nations, which now what seems ages ago, when we were able to hop on a plane and get to places. And what struck me was how well integrated your plans, your defense plans and response plans are to all sorts of contingencies with civil and military, and you really regard this as a whole of society effort. And I think this is a best practice that the other allies will also have been benefiting from and should be taken very seriously. Education is very important. Young people, you have to explain and tell them and interact with them in order to make them much more aware of all these dangers that are presented by disinformation and other hybrid tactics.
Thank you very much. Time is running out, but I will try to take a couple of more questions. One relates to NATO EU cooperation. It comes from Jim Townsend. Was there an increase in NATO EU cooperation during this time? And if so, what did that cooperation look like? And is it continuing? And first and foremost, I would like our two panelists in Brussels to respond to this, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond, and it's a great question and extremely relevant. So from the point of view of an ally or EU member state, purely on a sort of personal level, cooperation certainly intensified. I mean, I had regular contact, I think once a week, with my colleagues on the EU side of the house, downtown, as we say here in NATO, just to see how the EU is responding, talking about how NATO is responding, and of course, from the point of view of a small nation as we are, it's extremely important to not have sort of a doubling of effort on both sides of the house. But that's on a sort of very personal level. But we've always been supporting, of course, closer NATO EU cooperation, and I think it's quite telling that actually one of the first ministerials that was mentioned, that was held by video during the actual crisis, or at the beginning of the crisis. We had actually the EU side participating. High Representative Borrell was present and will be also at the Defense Ministerial next week. I think it's extremely important. We'll also have Finland and Sweden, but also Australia, which is also telling, and that sort of speaks to the point that Sven was making, that NATO needs to be more engaged with Asia Pacific partners, and indeed I think that's already happening. So I'm happy to report. But I think it was a very good point that Sven made. Yes, EU-NATO cooperation is absolutely key, and not least on issues like disinformation. I think where the EU has actually been doing a lot of very good work for a number of years on sort of bringing false narratives to the fore. Actually sort of debunking false information, and they have a very well-developed system there. I think also NATO's been doing a lot on that, and sort of making sure that the NATO sort of, or our narrative, is out there as well. I mean, you can't. We don't do propaganda, of course. None of us do. We're democracies, but we can try and fight this with actually just giving pure facts of how allies have helped each other, how there's been a lot of support and solidarity.
a brief comment from any of the other panelists on this? Okay, well, thank you very much. I intend to stick to the timeline. We had planned 1 hour for this discussion. I'm very sorry that we are not able to respond to all the questions that we have received. I hope that all the questions received at least partial responses due to the 5-minute interventions and also perhaps fragments from other interventions. So with that, I would like to thank all 3 panelists for your time and for very good interventions. I would also like to say thanks to the organizers of this event, the Estonian Atlantic Treaty Organization, and also NATO PDD in Brussels. And last but not least, certainly all technical staff who have been busy ensuring that the platforms work well and are able to support this event. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you once more, and I am already looking forward to seeing you next time in other fora. Thank you.
Martin, I'm very sorry. Can I just want to respond to one thing that Sven said, and I'm sorry to prolong it, but I think I see it more nuanced than the picture he drew of the US and its sort of losing of interest, etc. And I would also point out that one thing that we didn't discuss today is terrorism, which also very much still is a threat for all the allies, including the US. And I think I don't see the US completely disengaging from the Middle East, if only for that reason. And there are, I think, other reasons as well. So I would say that there are other things that bring us together, other common threats and challenges as well, a little bit beyond what we have discussed today.
Thank you for that clarification as well. And it's always good to have different views on topics. So thank you once more to everybody, and looking forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.